Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest returning to this show is none other than Tony Heller, the notorious climate skeptic who goes under the nom de guerre, Stephen Goddard. Welcome back, Tony.
Yeah, thanks, James. It's great to be here.
Since we last, was it about a year since?
Yeah,
it's
been just about exactly a year.
Okay. Are we winning? Are we winning the climate wars?
I believe we are.
Oh, what's happened then?
Well, you've got Trump over there in the United States, and he does all these tweets which get people terribly distracted. And meanwhile, where they're not looking, he's been sort of undermining the whole global warming infrastructure in the U.S. government.
I knew that Scott Pruitt, after a shaky start, was starting to make some progress. But tell me what's been happening over there.
Well, I know I live in Boulder, Colorado, which is home to NOAA and NCAR and National Snow and Ice Data Center and numerous other sort of climate agencies. Right. And the people there they're all convinced that they're going to be laid off.
Oh, that's so sad. That's kind of like death of Little Nell times 10, as I often say. So you're surrounded by government's activist scientists running scared.
Right, exactly.
That's good. Why has it taken Trump so long the administration to get rid of these people?
Well, there's a huge number of them, for one thing. Right. And in order to do it, he has to have some infrastructure in place. And there's been a lot of resistance from Democrats in Congress to getting his nominees accepted.
Yeah.
So it's been a long, slow process, but it really hasn't been that long. I mean, he's really done a tremendous amount over the past year.
Yes, it's certainly the case, isn't it, that had it been Obama, say, who had problems in his first year getting his plans through, he wouldn't have been criticised in nearly the same way that Trump was. I mean, we're told that Trump has been a complete failure because he hasn't achieved everything he wants to achieve in the first year. Well,
I think Trump's actually accomplished quite a bit during his first year, but like I said, he's keeping everybody distracted, looking the other direction with his Twitter stuff, and yeah. I think he's getting his agenda done.
I read your tweets, and you don't just tweet about climate change and environmentalism. Well, there's your main areas, but you're quite an out Trump fan. Do you think people are coming around, or is it still that kind of tremendous divide between sort of red meat Trump voters and in the entirety of the rest of the world?
Well, there's obviously this huge divide, like you said. You've got the press, which is completely against Trump, and they will.
Apart from Breitbart, which seems to be mildly
that's right, exactly.
Lol.
But I've CNN, New York Times, PBS, all these news outlets in the United States are, it's 100% Trump. If you go through their websites or listen to their broadcasts, it's just one propaganda piece after another against him. But at the same time, the same thing was going on during the campaign, and CNN would report the latest opinion polls that Hillary was going to win by more than 10 percentage points.
And did that happen? I forget what it was.
I don't believe that did happen.
Okay.
And there was one great news story from about 10 days before the election. It was Hillary doesn't even bother to think about Trump anymore because she's so far ahead in the polls. All she's thinking about is what she's going to do after she's president. So it's nonstop propaganda. And it was before the election, it is now. But I have a feeling that he's probably going to be reelected easily.
In the parallel universe where Hillary won the election, do you think the Third World War has already started and possibly destroyed the planet already?
Oh, not necessarily the Third World War, but continued degradation of liberties and integrity in the government was certainly in the cards.
You think you're lonely in the US, being a sort of an outspoken Trump fan. I can't tell you what it's like over here.
Yeah.
I mean, it's bad enough being a Brexiteer. That means automatically
Right.
that 48% of the country, well, maybe less now because I think some of them are coming around, but maybe 30% of the country doesn't like you very much and thinks you're wrong and lunatic. And in the media, it's more like 90% maybe. But if you admit to being pro-Trump, I mean, even when I write about this in The Spectator, which is our most distinguished right-wing journal publication, even then I'm sort of viewed as a kind of a freak, somebody who's just an attention seeker, and this doesn't really come from my intellect or my heart. I'm just saying this to troll people. Why is that?
Well, there's been this mass propaganda campaign against him.
Trump, you're talking about Trump derangement syndrome.
Yeah, Trump derangement syndrome, exactly. And so all that people have heard is the one side of the story. It's like we've had a trial going on for the last couple of years where only the prosecution was heard.
Yeah.
The defense never gets their say in the press, so that's what people hear, so that's what they believe.
I'm torn here because on the one hand, I have seen much which would suggest to me that there is such a thing as wisdom of crowds, well, most notably in Brexit. But at the same time, I think, are people that easily bought by propaganda, when you've got a media which is so relentlessly hostile to Trump? Do people not see beyond that?
Well, no, I think people I know who are like regular PBS. Public broadcasting listeners, they're completely bought off on all the propaganda they hear, whether it's Trump, politics, global warming. I don't think PBS ever goes 5 minutes without mentioning race, gender, or climate.
Yeah.
Those words come up at least once every 5 minutes. It's just nonstop brainwashing.
I'm disturbed by this. I mean, you and I have both sacrificed a lot, if nothing else, in terms of friendships, for taking our position on climate change. And although you say there's cause for optimism, I'm just thinking of let me give you one example of something that's happened to me recently. Last year, I wrote a piece in The Spectator about ocean acidification, and I marshalled various evidence and scientific papers to demonstrate that it was a busted flush, that whatever the Royal Society may tell you, whatever NOAA may claim, actually the evidence is at best flimsy, and that there are a few canny activist scientists who've taken a lot of money from government for research into this non-existent problem. And I wrote it very, very carefully, so that when I was taken to the IPSO, which is what used to be called the Press Complaints Commission, they examined it, and even though IPSO is biased against people like me, they found in my favour. There was no case to answer, and the activist scientist who brought the case, who was heavily invested in the ocean acidification industry on the bandwagon, he had lots of funding. He was mortified by this, and he threw his toys out of the pram, and he made sort of veiled threats to me and stuff in correspondence. And I thought, well, at least the witch is dead. So the other day there was a BBC series by David Attenborough and about the oceans, Blue Planet 2, beautifully shot, lots of moving shots about whales dying, baby whales. You plastic bag, you. I don't want them to die of plastic bags. That's by the way. But what does he say at the end of I think the final episode? He says the coral reefs will not be with us by 2050 because of ocean acidification. They'll all have dissolved. And David Attenborough states this as fact, as scientific fact, backed up by the Royal Society. In other words, what I'm saying here, the BBC, our leading naturalist on TV, the Royal Society, whichever scientific institutions are still pushing the ocean acidification scare, it's as if the facts were completely irrelevant. They can just go on printing the same old propaganda and get away with it. They're never held to account. I haven't been offered a piece in the Mail or the Sun or even any right-wing newspapers saying this is complete bullshit. The lies go on, oblivious.
Oh, right. Well, corals evolved during the Cambrian era, 600 million years ago, when CO2 levels were 20 times higher than they are now. So the whole concept of ocean acidification is absurd. The corals can obviously tolerate much higher carbon dioxide levels than we're currently experiencing because most of their existence on this planet, carbon dioxide levels were much higher. So the whole and an interesting thing is, I've done some contract work with at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and I remember a conversation with a climate scientist about 15 years ago, and he said, "Well, even if this climate stuff it isn't true, we still doing the right thing because of ocean acidification." So it's sort of their backup plan B thing.
You're the first person I've heard who's actually spoken to somebody who admits, somebody in the enemy camp who admits that. But certainly that was one of the arguments I made in my piece. I called ocean acidification the Siegfried line of the climate alarmists, because it seemed to me that, there was lots of evidence to show this, that the growth of ocean acidification research coincided with that period where I think the scientific alarmist establishment was just starting to realise that maybe this man-made CO2 climate scare wasn't going to survive any longer. And given that the whole of the global warming industry is predicated on CO2 being a problem, they had to find another excuse sharpish to show why CO2 had to be curtailed.
Yeah, the whole ocean acidification argument is just absurd. My undergraduate degree is in geology, and the oceans are lined by alkali rocks like basalts and other things, limestones, which if there's any tendency towards an increase in acid in the oceans, what happens is it just reacts with the rock and neutralizes it. So there's really no way to substantially move the pH of the oceans towards an acid because it immediately reacts with rocks around it and neutralizes. So,
what I like talking to you about this stuff is that you're on top of the science and you talk about it in a kind of very relaxed, reassuring voice. There's no hysteria there. I'm persuaded by you, and I think actually lots of people, if they sat down with you, they would be persuaded. But it doesn't really address the problem, does it? The fact that you've got these facts on your side and they're all very plausible and you can check them up and stuff, doesn't seem to answer this problem we have, which is that the people who control access to the media, the mouthpieces of the sort of seers and high priests and stuff, like David Attenborough, are given a platform by our state broadcaster in the UK at least to promulgate what are essentially lies. So how can we win when that is the case?
Well, So I've been following the global warming thing for about 40 years. So decade after decade, we get these predictions. Al Gore said the Arctic was going to be ice-free in 2014. NASA's Jay Zwally said it was going to be ice-free in 2012. James Hansen said it would be ice-free sometime between 2013 and 2018. None of these predictions are coming true. The New York Times had a story a few years ago titled "The End of Snow."
Like the independent one, the famous independent one. Yeah.
Snowfalls are now just a thing of a past. That was from the year 2000. I was just looking at a story from The Guardian from 2012 this morning. Drought is the new norm for the UK.
Right.
The Miami Beach is going to be underwater. James Hansen from NASA predicted that Manhattan would be underwater between 2008 and 2018, lower Manhattan. None of these things happen. And at some point, it's going to start registering with people that just quit listening because they keep hearing these predictions of disaster which never occur.
They might quit worrying, and they might quit that, it might sound like yada, 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 yada. At the same time, whenever I go on a platform to talk about these issues, I am always cast as the anti-science guy who is, in control of big oil, in the pay of big oil, I wish. And even when I present the facts in a kind of non-hysterical way like you do, what I find is that the response is, yeah, that's all very well, but we still believe, and we should be doing more, and it's as though the facts really don't matter.
Right. Well, Richard Feynman, the great American physicist, said, "Science is the belief in the ignorance of the experts." There's a huge amount of money involved in the whole global warming thing. In order for scientists to get funding, they have to present a problem. If they just came out and said, if the IPCC said, "Oh, global warming isn't really a problem," well, their funding's going to dry up. They're not going to get their nice conferences in Bali and Cancun and places like that. They lose their grants. They lose their jobs. They won't get tenureship at their university. So they have a tremendous conflict of interest to keep the global warming thing going.
Yes, in fact, I think that's why Trump may be the only answer. I think we should talk about that slightly in the next section before we move on to ICE and stuff. That you almost, whatever you say about Trump, however uncouth he may be, however vulgar, maybe we needed a monster to defeat this other monster.
Well, as George Bernard Shaw said, nothing was ever accomplished by a reasonable man.
I like that one. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Tony Heller, a.k.a. climate skeptic Stephen Goddard.
Sirius XM Patriot presents a brand new conservative show.
I'm Sonny Johnson. Check out my new show, Sonny's Corner. We take a lot of our context out of the conservative movement as a whole.
Mixing conservative principles and hip-hop culture.
We are created equal, yes, but created equal doesn't mean equal results, because I can't flow like Jay-Z doesn't make it Jay-Z's fault.
Sonny's Corner.
Saturdays at 1 p.m. Eastern on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Tony Heller, aka Stephen Goddard. You're a Trump fan, I'm a Trump fan, and we've made ourselves very unpopular in certain circles by endorsing this. I had an email only today from a friend who was... We agree on everything, but he was aghast that I should be speaking up for Donald Trump, who he considers just an appalling character. Just a poisonous oik was the phrase he used. But I was thinking, if we were at war and I was sending out some people on a mission, I would want the Dirty Dozen to go and do that mission. I wouldn't want Naomi Klein and I don't know, Owen Jones and George Monbiot and whoever, and David Attenborough, however telegenic they might be. I wouldn't want them to go and do this mission. And it seems to me we are at war right now. We have a great ideological war going on to do environmentally. It's to do with the battle between cheap, abundant fossil fuels versus expensive, inefficient,
environmentally
destructive,
right,
renewable energy. And you've got a very powerful... People laugh. One of the things that the left does, it's very good at sort of mocking reductio absurdum laughter. You say, what? The renewable energy industry against big oil? Yes, right, that's it. But it is actually the case that there is this incredibly powerful renewable energy industry which is dependent on sucking on the government teat. And if you, in order to unwind that corrupt industry, you need somebody who's got balls and sort of chutzpah and arrogance and isn't afraid of being seen to be uncaring and nasty.
Oh, absolutely. It really took someone with Trump's personality to take these people on, because it's an incredibly powerful, what I call the climate mafia. Yeah. You can't go up against them in a polite sort of fashion. And I've gotten frustrated in the past with some other climate skeptics who keep acting like this is some sort of scientific debate, and that's not what it's about at all. These people aren't interested in science. It's about money.
Yeah.
There's many aspects of the money, how the money is distributed, which makes it very important to a lot of different people that this global warming thing keeps going.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that actually. It's little discussed because I think it's very important to present a united front, but there undoubtedly are divisions in the tiny world of climate skepticism, aren't there?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I mean, I don't think you and I never feel like we're as loved as we ought to be. Perhaps because we're too forthright, maybe?
Well, okay, so it's interesting. So a number of climate skeptics sort of pretend that I don't exist, but at the same time, they had a Heartland conference recently in Chicago, and I was told that my videos, which I've been putting out on YouTube, where everybody was talking about them, how effective they were. So the same people who sort of don't acknowledge that I exist publicly are still are happy to talk privately and acknowledge that my work's been very valuable. So it's sort of a difference between what they're willing to say publicly and what they actually feel.
So yeah, you started doing these videos with charts on them and
Right.
using the data from places like NOAA and NASA. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, that's what all of the data that I use in my blogging and my videos is either data which was sourced from NOAA or NASA or some other government agency, or old newspaper articles. So it's all sources which are pretty much above reproach.
And do you find that you get a better response to your videos than you do to your blogs?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people, I've gotten a very good feedback about the videos. A lot of people like it, have it sort of the audio version of it, because they don't have to understand how the graphs work necessarily, because I explain in one or two sentences.
Right.
I explain in one or two sentences, fairly straightforward concepts, which I think even non-technical people can understand easily.
I've often wondered whether I should do more stuff. I mean, I'm loving my podcasts.
Yeah.
I think I'm reaching an audience that I hadn't reached before, or maybe I'm reaching the same audience, but in a different way. They're discovering a different side to me. Like I'm almost human. There's something about print, isn't there, which is colder.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm a warm, lovely guy, but a lot of people think that the person that they're reading behind the lines of my prose is a complete bastard who really doesn't like fluffy animals, doesn't like coral reefs, and doesn't like baby whales, and that maybe the irony or the humour maybe translates more. And I was wondering, in the same way, whether you've got your blogs, which I think are very, very effective, and I mean I plagiarise shamelessly because it's good. But I'm wondering whether there are certain people out there in this new world that we're facing, where people are much more, where younger people maybe are more attuned to visual things.
Yeah,
is that it?
I think that's part of it. I think the audio is very helpful. And I think people are used to being taught they went all through school having a teacher standing up at the front of the classroom talking to them. And I think it's just a learning mode which people have been in and been like that forever.
So what's the traffic are you getting on your videos?
I usually get about one view every 15 seconds for a few days after I.
When you said one view, I was thinking that's a bit worrying. But one view every 15 seconds is good.
Right. Yeah, they've gotten good response, and I know that the people, a lot of decision makers in Washington, view my stuff too.
Do they?
Yeah. So that's really the people who I feel like it's most important to.
Do you? Maybe that you're a sort of slightly sinister Rasputin figure that you're very influential, but no one wants to acknowledge you because you're kind of embarrassing.
Yeah.
to be seen to be with the actual Tony Heller. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's
if that is true.
well, it's interesting. So the New York Times did a hit piece on the front page for Scott Pruitt a few months ago,
Yeah.
and I was mentioned in that because I had given a presentation at the Washington State Senate a few months earlier, and it was tied into Scott Pruitt. And everything the New York Times said about me, they had a couple of paragraphs devoted to me, was incorrect. And what
you only kill a kitten a week rather than 2 kittens a week. That kind of detail.
And even the topic of my presentation to the Senate was they gave it incorrectly. So I contacted them and said, well, I'm right here. You can always here's my email. You can always, if you want to get in touch and get the facts straight and make a correction, I'm very easy to locate. And of course, they didn't respond back to me. And then I'm good friends with the publisher of the Santa Fe New Mexican, who knows top people at the New York Times, and she tried to get them to talk to me, and they won't do it. And I see this over and over again. I get hit pieces written about me, and New York Times and a lot of other news outlets, but they don't talk to me. And I'm always challenging people on the other side to debate. I say, I'm right here. I want to debate. I want to talk to you. I want to give an interview to you. But other than Breitbart, other than you, James, I never get these sort of direct interviews.
Yeah. I wouldn't like to debate you. I think you just wear me down with arguments and facts and stuff, and I don't think you'd lose your temper. You don't seem to me a very kind of...
No, I'm very confident in my position, so I don't really have any need to get angry.
When they demonize you, because this is their technique, isn't it? I get this a lot.
Right.
The techniques used against me are... Their favourite is the Paul Nurse hit video that happened a few years ago. The BBC and the Royal Society's then new president collaborated on this hit job, and this is the kind of what they do. I'm James Delingpole. He's only got an English literature degree.
Right.
He doesn't read peer-reviewed papers. Just stuff that's kind of irrelevant to the argument. Surely the only questions that should matter in these cases are: has this person got his facts straight?
Right.
In which case, how do we counter them? But if you can't even do that, if the best you can do is add harm, it seems to me that you've got a very flawed case. So I was wondering what they do to you to try and undermine you as a credible witness.
Well, I had an entertaining exchange on Twitter the other day with Bob Ward.
Yes.
And he was attacking me. He said his tweet was something about we had a really warm day back in Colorado due to a Chinook winds, which happens pretty often in the winter. And he says, this is something you'll never hear about from Uber denier Steve Goddard.
So you're Uber denier.
So I was sitting on the plane about to leave for the UK. So I tweeted back to him. I said, well, Chinooks actually don't have anything to do with global warming. And I'm sitting on a plane in cold Denver right now. I'm headed over to the UK. So why don't we get together while I'm there and we can have a debate? And I didn't hear back from him for about 2 days. And finally he tweeted back, he said, after you get your stuff peer reviewed, then we'll debate. So I came back I said, so basically you don't have any arguments against me, but you want someone else to figure out what's wrong with what I'm saying.
Bob Ward is not the only distinguished climate alarmist to have been confused by Chinooks. Of course, Leo DiCaprio,
right.
when he made the film where he gets raped by the bear,
right.
Very movingly, tragically, he was going on a lecture circuit talking about how there's the incredible that they were trying to film the snowy scenes, but then these unexpected hot winds went and melted all the ice, and he too had not been aware of the phenomenon that is the Chinook.
Right, and that's we get those on the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains. We get those all the time. It's I've had mornings we woke up, it was minus 15 Fahrenheit, and we had a foot of snow on the ground. By the afternoon, it was 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and all the snow had melted.
That must be a pain in the ass when you're trying to go for a walk and you're deciding whether to wear a puffer jacket or a kind of t-shirt.
Right. Yeah, it could be living in Boulder. It could be, it's really hard because we get these huge swings in temperature in the winter. It can go between frigid and balmy back and forth twice in a day.
Have you been, if you're in Colorado, have you been to the special valley where they all go to in Atlas Shrugged, where all the libertarians live?
No,
I
haven't been there.
Because I'd like to go there.
Okay.
I think we may have to soon, you know.
Okay, sounds good.
Colorado is in a. I mean, I've never been to Colorado. Should I? Is that a mistake in my life?
It's certainly it's a place you should definitely visit. Yeah, it's spectacular scenery
For the weed and the.
Yeah. Well, it's a very colorful culture.
Especially if you had the right strain.
Right. And it's sort of an interesting combination. There's a lot of sort of liberal elements from like Californians who've moved into Colorado, but at the same time there's a strong libertarian thing. So you get this sort of weird thing of people are very insistent on gun rights. But at the same time, there are a lot of very liberal stuff, like with the global warming and with the weed. So it's sort of an interesting. It's hard to sort of stereotype to put Coloradans into a box because they sort of fit into several different boxes.
Right. Denver appears a lot in On the Road.
Right.
As a kind of hub where they're all traveling to and from.
Right.
That's but Denver, I imagine, is just like a god awful place now, isn't it?
Oh, I'm not a big fan of the city of Denver, but Boulder is 30 miles away, and it's a really beautiful place. I'm a cyclist, and they've got great bike trails.
I kind of hate cyclists, but at the same time,
Well, I can understand that in the UK because in the UK, cyclists have to go in the road, but in Boulder,
and they all have 3 testicles. Do you know that?
There were 3 testicles.
Yeah, they do. I'm afraid, and they block the road for my car.
Right.
When I'm trying to drive along fast.
Right.
On a country road, and there they all are in their bloody lycra.
Right.
And do you know what else they do? They show their dominance of the road by cycling side by side and having conversations. I mean, fuck off. If you're going to go on a bike, just cycle silently and get your exercise and then get out of the way.
I noticed that yesterday when I was driving down from Salisbury towards Southampton. Yeah. I noticed that there was cyclists riding side by side. In the States, they don't do that, actually.
I hope they'd be shot in the States for that kind of behaviour.
Yeah.
And frankly, in the UK, I think if we had gun rights, that would happen.
Right.
Yeah. So it wouldn't happen in the States.
Well, there's probably a few people who do it, but I think people are pretty well understand that the side-by-side thing is not socially acceptable.
I think you have more of an unapologetic car culture in the US, don't you?
Right. But where I live in Boulder, I don't actually have to ride on the roads because we have dedicated bike trails just about everywhere, which is fabulous.
Yes. No, I would like that.
Right.
I have enjoyed going on bike trails before on mountain bikes. Well, it's quite scary going down. I mean, if you've ever gone over some handlebars,
yeah.
I mean, I've completely buggered up my wrists
Right.
as a result of going over some handlebars in London traffic.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I've got a friend who was a massage therapist. A few years ago, he went over the handlebars after work, broke his neck. He's quadriplegic now.
Oh, yeah. People say, I've been banned from fox hunting.
Yeah.
I should just have been banned from cycling, which is way more dangerous.
Right.
Yeah, and I could live with being banned from cycling. The fox hunting ban hurts a lot more. Yeah. So in the last section, I promised it in the previous section, but I think in the last section we should talk about ice.
Yeah.
Because hey, ice, yeah, but ice, baby. Because this seems to be one of the key indicators that these global warmists are wrong. So you're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, evil, cackling, wicked Tony Heller, aka Climate Denier in Chief of the US. Stephen Goddard. More in a moment.
Hey folks, I want to tell you about Breitbart News' Second Amendment newsletter, Downrange with A.W.R. Hawkins. Features the top gun stories of the week every week, and guest columnists like Gun Owners of America's Larry Pratt or Armed American Radio's Mark Walters. Also features a review of a firearm or firearm accessory each week. The newsletter downloads on Thursday, comes right to your email inbox. You can subscribe at Breitbart.com/AWR.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Tony Heller, aka Stephen Goddard. And Stephen or Tony, which do you prefer in real
Tony.
life? You do prefer Tony.
Stephen Goddard was just a name I was using back at a time when I was working for companies where I couldn't really let people know that I was working for some very green companies, and had word gotten out that I was doing this, I would have been fired. And ultimately I was when I attended a EU climate thing in Lisbon, came back, and the next day I was fired. So.
Wow. I think everyone on our side of the argument has got a similar story.
Right, and people keep saying, we're making all this money from big oil. This is it's cost me literally hundreds of thousands of dollars doing this.
Can I have a quick bitch about that? Actually, as my industry collapses, and it's a really shit industry to try and make a living out of journalism. Okay. Breitbart is a special situation. It's kind of like the sort of the lifeboat that saves shipwrecked passengers like me from, because the media is so left wing and stuff. So I'm always thinking of new ways of earning a living when finally it all collapses. And one of my plans was to sort of really do a bit of PR for the oil industry and fossil fuel industries, and just simply going out there and saying, well, hang on a second, kids, your anorak is made of oil products. The tent you go camping in is made of oil products. You can't demonize this fossil fuel industries, whatever the teacher tells you. Anyway, I go to this PR agency, corporate PR agency, which is now dead. It had a disastrous PR problem in South Africa, and the whole agency got wiped out. But at the time, it was minted, and it had lots and lots of clients, including in the oil industry. And I had this incredibly sticky meeting with this incredibly snotty woman who handled all the oil industry accounts, and she was such a complete bitch to me. She was vile, absolutely vile, and it was clear to me that as far as the industry she represented was concerned, they did not want to have anything to do with climate skeptics. They did not want to give them their money, even to promote the industry, because actually it much more suited them to buy off green industries like the Shell, for example, sponsored for many years the Guardian environment pages. They prefer paying Danegeld to the Danes. They do not give money to people like me. Okay, my rant over. I wanted to talk to you about ice,
Right?
Because I thought, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't the Arctic supposed to be ice-free in summers by now?
It is. If you go back to 10 years ago in December of 2007, the press was just full of stories about predictions from scientists. NASA's Jay Zwally, who was their leading Arctic expert, predicted the Arctic would be ice-free during the summer of 2012. The BBC had a big story featuring guys from the Naval College in California predicting that the Arctic would be ice-free in 2013. Al Gore in 2009 predicted the Arctic would be ice-free in 2014. And Sweden's top expert in 2007 predicted the Arctic would be ice-free in 2008. A number of people, David Barber from the University of Manitoba and Mark Cerise from National Snow and Ice Data Center both predicted that the North Pole would be ice-free in 2008. So we've had this long, incredible, particularly around 10 years ago, just one blasted out after another. The Arctic's going to be ice-free very soon, and it's due to emissions from your sport utility vehicle that were causing this. And so now we have 10 years later, we can go back and look at all these predictions. And there's actually been no change in Arctic sea ice over the last decade at all. If you plot out the trend line from the minimum of 2007 through the minimum of this past summer, 10 years later, there's no trend whatsoever.
There was a period, though, wasn't there, when it did look like the Arctic ice was thinning?
Well, okay, so this whole story is very interesting. So when you see these graphs from like NOAA and the National Snow and Ice Data Center, they always start in 1979. And the story they always tell is they say that was the start of the satellite era. That's how they always describe it. But it's not true. What actually happened was, if you go back and look at the 1990 IPCC report, they had satellite data going back to 1972. And this is very important because in 1972, there was a lot less ice than in 1979. And if you go back and look at there was a DOE report published in 1985, they have ice data going back to about 1920. And what you realize is when you look at that is that 1979, where all the graphs start now, was right at the century peak for Arctic ice. So by starting right at the peak, they can create these fake trend lines, making it look like ice is headed downwards linearly. But actually what it is, it's a cycle. Around 1940, it was very warm in the Arctic, and ice was melting very rapidly. I've got thousands of old newspaper articles from the leading experts at the time talking about how Greenland was melting down, the glaciers there faced catastrophic collapse. Arctic sea ice had thinned 30%, and its volume had decreased tremendously. So we had a lot of warming from about 1920 through 1945. It stayed very warm, and then around 1960, after 1958, temperatures in the Arctic started plummeting. And if you look back to stories from the 1970s, Iceland, Reykjavik, was having a lot of problems with their seaports getting blocked with ice, and it was the first time in the 20th century that occurred. So it went through a period of a lot of warming up to about 1945, then it cooled a lot till about late 1970s, and 1979 was right at the coldest period in Iceland. It was the coldest year in the temperature record in Iceland. The ice is very thick, and that's where they start their graphs from. So by starting if you start at the top of a mountain, any direction you go is down. And that's what they do. They start their graphs right at the peak now to make it look like it's... So from about 1979 to around 2007, there was what I would describe as a cyclical decline in ice, just like we had from the 1940s and through the 1970s. But then, since 2007, there's been no change in the ice, and it's actually starting to look like it may be starting to increase now. There's actually a lot more thick ice in the Arctic now than there was on this date 10 years ago.
Is there any observable correlation between the movements of the Arctic sea ice and global temperatures generally, or are they separate?
Well, my assertion about the global temperature record is that it's just garbage. It's meaningless garbage. Right. It's a fabrication. There is not enough temperature data prior to about 1950 from most of the Earth to really establish any sort of long-term global temperature record. But we do have pretty good temperature records from the Arctic, from Iceland and Greenland, going back to the 19th century. Yeah. And certainly before NASA tampers with the data, if you just look at the raw data, that's a very close correlation between Arctic sea ice and the temperature there. But what's really interesting is there's something called the Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation, which is an ocean current, and extremely good correlation between that and temperatures in Iceland and Arctic ice. So it's not the carbon dioxide which has been driving the cyclical changes in Arctic ice. It's just been ocean circulation patterns.
And what cycle does that move on?
Well, okay, so my good friend Dr. Bill Gray from Colorado State University, the tropical meteorologist and hurricane forecaster, who passed away last year, he spent a lot of time talking to me about this, and his theory is that it was thermohaline circulations. So he believed that in the middle of the Atlantic, there was a large area which tends to be sort of cloud-free. And it goes through cyclical changes where the sun beats down on it, a lot of water evaporates out of it, becomes very saline. So you get this warm saline water, and eventually it becomes saline water is heavier than than the fresher water in other parts of the ocean. So eventually it would start to sink down, go down, and then it would start moving towards the poles and would force this sort of circulation. And so then after a while, then the water in the mid-Atlantic would become less saline and the circulation would reduce. You'd get less of this going on. So that's what he believed it had to do with the salinity of the oceans, particularly in the mid-Atlantic was what was driving these circulation patterns. And so if you look at the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation, you see a very regular 70-year cycle on it. It was very warm in 1940. It was very warm around 1910. It looks like it may be about to start going down again now, in which case we would expect to see cooler Arctic temperatures and more sea ice.
So yeah, I was thinking about that. So presumably we had our last warm period in the peak in the 1980s. So that means we're screwed in terms of having nice weather again in our lifetime.
Yeah, it seems possible, and we also now not only are we started down into probably a colder spell part of the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation, but we also have this grand solar minimum, which historically have been 10 or 20 years after the sunspots went quiet, and things turned very cold in Europe.
Isn't it really sad that? Because I remember the 80s, as I think probably you do as well. And when we were having that last burst of heat before winter comes, I remember sort of being bombarded with media reports telling me why this was a bad thing and I shouldn't be enjoying it because we were going to hell in a handcart. So it's a bit like being young. You don't appreciate it until it's gone. We didn't appreciate that heat. And now we'll never know it again.
Right.
Only our wretched children or grandchildren may glimpse.
Right. Well, what's entertaining for me is I was talking to a woman, a CU professor, at a party a few weeks ago, who had just given a distinguished lecture about migrations due to climate change from Mexico. And she said people are moving north in North America due to climate change. And I said, my understanding is that people are moving south, that the population of the northern states has declined tremendously, and people have moved down to the Gulf Coast where they didn't used to live before air conditioning. So and if you go down, I spent a lot of Thanksgivings down in Mexico and along the Riviera Maya, and the place is full of Canadians. You don't see Mexicans vacationing in the winter in Canada. You see hundreds of thousands of Canadians going down to Mexico because people like warm weather.
Well, surely there are statistics that could decide it one way or the other, whether you're right or this lecturer was right.
Oh, I'm quite certain that I'm right. I have no idea where she came up with her stuff, but it's well known that New York has lost a tremendous amount of population, whereas Florida and Texas have boomed.
But this is why. What I was saying earlier, I think has some truth in it, that we live, as far as the left is concerned, in a post, what they christened a post-truth world, a post-fact world, and they were using it to mock people like Trump. But it seems to me that it applies far more to the way that the liberal left operates.
Oh yeah,
you've got academics saying stuff which is objectively not true, provably not true,
right. And
yet getting tenure and being paid, not being sacked, and getting away with it.
Yeah, that's what I essentially do in my blog and in my videos. Is I just take a specific study that's just been published, right, and show how everything that these people are saying is the exact opposite of what the data shows. And I've been doing this for 10 years. Say, this is what they're saying. Let's look at the actual data from NOAA and NASA before it's tampered with, and we see that it's the exact opposite.
I have a feeling. Another feeling about why it is that you're unpopular and why it is that I'm unpopular. That we don't do what many people on our side of the argument would like us to do, which is to sugar the pill. We don't pull our punches. I think a lot of you see this, for example, in our appallingly useless Conservative Party, that in the UK at the moment. They are worried about advocating properly conservative policies because they're frightened that if they do, people might not like them, or people might find these policies frightening and too red meat. So at every stage, they're trying to water it down in order to make themselves more acceptable. And your position on the whole climate change is global warming really hasn't happened in any measurable sense in the 20th century. It's all bunk. It's all created. It's all manipulated data by a corrupt science establishment. And people just find that too strong meat. They just don't want it. They don't want it to be about that. They want it to be about marginal things.
People always accuse me of conspiracy theory. And I said, I'm not talking about any conspiracy. I'm talking about corruption. I'm talking about billions of dollars at risk here, a massive conflict of interest, and it's not a conspiracy any more than any other corruption, which we see all the time. The editor of Lancet said that he thinks that 50% of published medical papers are fraudulent. It's a huge problem in academia. In order to bring the funding in, you have to have a scary story. You have to have a problem. And these people, they want to keep their jobs. They want to keep their nice, cushy meetings. They want to fly all over the world and get media attention. And they're not going to give it up. It's a conflict of interest. Yeah.
Yes. I don't think I've ever heard the ICE case put so robustly. I read skeptics saying, yeah, well, maybe it's too early to say or stuff. I'd been completely unaware, for example, that this stuff about the satellite records having begun in 1979 is not true.
Oh, right, yeah.
I thought it was an article of absolute objective faith, of truth, that the satellite record began in 1979.
No, the Navy was keeping very good weekly satellite records of Arctic sea ice going back to the early 1970s. And I've actually... National Geographic had an article in 1964 showing satellite images of the Arctic and the Antarctic ice. So, we've been in space. The first satellites went up in the 1950s, right? So we've had the ability to view the Arctic. You remember those pictures from the moon missions, right? Very extremely good high-resolution pictures of the Earth from 1969, looking back. So the idea that we didn't have good satellite knowledge about what was going on in the Arctic until 1979 is absurd.
So you quoted a number of experts predicting the end of Arctic sea ice. Has any of them shown any contrition or embarrassment?
Well, what they do is they just keep pushing the date back, right? 10 years ago, people were saying it'll be by 2012, it'll be by 2013, now they're saying 2030. But there's no indication. There's been no trend over the last 10 years. And if you go back and look at the trend, I actually did a blog post about that this morning. If you go back and look at the change since the peak in 1979, it's actually been quite small. So even if you accepted that 1979 as your start date, if you extrapolate it out, you're still looking, a century or two out. But it's a completely fake date to start with. You go back to 1972, the curve looks completely different.
So just to conclude, there was less ice in the 1940s than there is now?
I don't know. It's hard to say if there was less ice, but I would think it was probably fairly comparable around 1940 to what we've got now. Yeah.
So the Arctic, the North Pole isn't going to disappear anytime soon?
No. Well, okay, so it's funny because they always talk about climate skeptics or flat earthers, but quite literally, they are the flat earthers. So if you give me a minute to explain here. So they look at these maps of the Arctic sea ice, right? And they're always flat projections looking down at the North Pole. And they say, well, it shrank so much from 1979 to the present. But the fact is that the Earth is not flat, it's round. So what happens is that the angle of the sun at the North Pole is much lower than it is say in Alaska. And by early September, there's almost no sunlight left at reaching the North Pole anymore. So it's impossible for the ice to completely disappear, because even if you lose a lot of ice during August and the ice melts up to the 80th parallel, there's really no sunlight after that, and there's no energy source to melt the ice anymore. So the ice has been melting back to close to the 80th parallel. Beyond that, it's with the current climate regime, it's basically impossible. It would require some very radical change in Earth's climatic conditions in order to melt that last 10 degrees north. And it's because the Earth is round.
I like that. I think that's a good way of concluding that climate alarmists are the true flat earthers. Thank you very much, Tony Heller, aka Stephen Goddard, aka most evil climate denier in America. Thank you for appearing on the show again. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole. Thank you so much, and goodbye.